one thing I'd also be interested in getting into with is comparing some of this Thomistic natural law theory with perhaps some of Scotus's natural law theory. I don't know how familiar you are with it at all.
No, with Scotus, not much.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask,
Mm.
are you familiar with Dietrich von Hildebrand at all?
Oh, you know, I have his books in my cart in Amazon, but I've never checked them out. So,
Okay. Yes, I've heard, I haven't actually read him, but I've heard he's very similar to Scotus on a lot of these
hmm,
issues. Because the concern that both of them have is that a entirely eudaimonistic theory of ethics could quickly become a selfish theory of ethics.
yeah.
And that
Mm,
both of them want to say they're not like Luther, because Luther will argue that no, actually seeking your own happiness is sinful. And that what was it? That's an example of how even when we do good, we're actually just seeking sin. But Scotus's theory is not that that's sinful. He thinks that that's a good thing. He calls it the affection for benefit, or the affectio commode. And he says, though, it has to be subordinate to the affection for justice, the affectio justitiae, which is the seeking of the good for its own sake. So he'll distinguish, right? What would I get? Trying to give an example, like acting rightly so that it will bring you happiness, and acting rightly because the act is intrinsically good. And
mhm.
he'd say both of those are good things, but the intrinsically good act is better. And the reason he's concerned about this is he thinks there's some things that could actually be harmful to our flourishing that are the right moral stance. So one of his classic examples is the sacrifice of Isaac, that it doesn't seem to benefit Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And it would seem at first glance to go against natural law. But he's going to argue, no, it was the intrinsically right thing. And the reason it was the intrinsically right thing is that because God created the natural law, and the natural law does exist for our flourishing, but it more strictly exists for sake of justice. And so God could dispense from the natural law for some reason if that would be the better thing to do in this situation. And so in this situation with the sacrifice of Isaac, since that's what God had commanded here, that was actually be the more just, even though it would seem to hurt Abraham's flourishings. He won't have a child now. And it would go against the natural law in terms of thou shalt not murder. So I'm
Mhm.
curious if your thoughts on that, where you would respond from a Thomistic perspective.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to kind of parse in that, right? And so I'll try to
Yeah,
take it bit by
that's
bit. I
fair. Yeah.
mean, the first thing that you mentioned was the worry that eudaimonistic theories of morality can become selfish, and I think that's a valid concern. Um, but I don't think it's a concern intrinsic to natural law theory. It's an abuse that can
Yeah.
definitely result because I mean, you know, when Aquinas talks about how the final end of man is happiness,
Mhm.
and then he goes on to say, you know, but it is happiness that's ultimately found in God, obviously.
Mhm.
um but nonetheless, I mean, it is happiness in the sense of, you know, feeling that, having that sense of fulfillment. But it's not just, right, the feeling of it, because when you hear happiness you think an emotion. I mean, it's like actually, metaphysically speaking, and having that fulfillment, having that integrity, and then you have to find joy sometimes. I mean, it's more mature to finally find joy in simply the act being right, or it being intrinsically just. So, for instance, it feels good, for me to open the door, for an elderly lady, right? But I mean, and that it's okay for me to feel good about it and have that be a motivation. Like, hey, I want to feel happy. Opening the door for this elderly lady makes you feel happy, right?
Mhm.
But on the other hand, there's also this idea that I should also open the door because I respect this woman for her own sake, right? And I want to do something kind to her, not because I want anything in return, but because it's simply I want her to be further better off, right? And
Yeah.
so, um, I mean, obviously, I think part of forming a mature conscience is developing the latter view, but the former view isn't illegitimate; it's just incomplete, so to
Yeah.
speak. Um,
It's an interesting way of phrasing this. I think that is what Scotus is getting at. He's not saying that doing things for our own happiness is bad, but it's inferior to doing things because they're the right thing. And
yeah.
I think the
Mm-hmm.
concern is, at least I've heard it articulated of some forms of Thomistic natural, and it might not fall into your explanation of it, is that it can make happiness the only goods. The only reason that we would want to help the lady into the elevator is
Mm-hmm.
that it would be bring us the most happiness to do so.
Yeah, and at that point, then you're basically turning natural law theory into something like utilitarianism, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, the interesting thing is that what natural law theory says is like, no, I mean, there's some truth in utilitarianism. There's some truth in generally just consequentialism. There's some truth in Kantianism, so all these other theories of morality.
Mhm.
But what natural law theory is just saying is, but it's trying to get it's saying that it is the best
Of all of
or
them.
has the best of these components in them. Yeah, in it.
Yeah.
Now, the question about God and the natural law, that's an interesting question. Because before I got into all this research on the papacy and the Catholic Church and the magisterium, I was actually doing a lot of research in this area on God and natural law. And so, there's this question, is God bound by the natural law or is he above it? Right. And so there's no really simple answer to this, but and also this gets into your theory about divine ethics. So for example, if I mean, so take the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Does God do something because it's good, or is it good because God does it? Right. And so the problem is that if you take the former hypothesis that God does something because it's good, well, there sounds like there's a standard of goodness that even God is under, right? And
mhm.
so he has to answer to the standard of goodness that doesn't seem to correspond well to God being the supreme being, right? Then the second option, and people have different ways of cashing out the Euthyphro. So if you don't
Mhm.
like my description, there are other ways to describe it, kind of. But the second view is like, but if God does something, then that just makes it good. Well, then the problem is that morality becomes arbitrary at that point. It just
Yeah.
becomes divine moral relativism. Now, the solution of the natural law theorist, or at least people in the classical tradition, is that God is goodness itself, right? God
Mhm.
is pure being, he's pure act. And then, of course, if you want to include any nuances in that, you can, right?
Mhm.
But when we get down to God's relationship with human beings, I mean, one thing to point out is because God is above us, right? God is, in the classical theistic sense, like God is so above us that when we say God has a will, we're not saying that he has, just like you and me, an exact will and
Mhm.
intellect, right? And you can parse these out neatly. I mean, we're saying that there's something in God that is like an intellect or like a will, but in reality, he's just pure one pure perfect singularity, so to speak. Um, but even our words are kind of constraining the infinite reality of God. Um, Now, with that being the case, God is not a moral agent like you and me. So he's not on equal playing field so that we can judge him like he's just any other human being. Um, and then also with that being the case, I mean, think about with respect to humans and animals, right? Humans have different obligations to each other than they do to animals, and humans can treat animals in certain ways that they couldn't treat other humans. Now, if that's the case, then I mean, one inference that I had is that, well, if God is our ontological and moral superior, then he would also have privileges that he would have uniquely given what he is that we wouldn't have given what we are. Right
Yeah.
now, you got to cash this out so that you avoid some problems, right? And that was kind of my research project for a while. If I try to do it now, it's just going to come out garbled and messed up. And so
Mhm.
I'll
That's
just
fair.
say
Yeah.
that was part of my research project before I got into all this.
Yeah, that makes sense.